Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations, everyone. My name is Andy. On this channel, I discuss issues related to a Christian response to an atheistic or skeptic worldview. Currently, we're going through I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek. These are the contents of the book. If you have found value in my work, please consider supporting my ministry by purchasing my published work, Pinnacles and Plateaus, the volume on the first 30 chapters of the Book of Psalms. It's available where books are sold. The publisher is Zulon Press. Chapter 6, and I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, is entitled New Life Forms, From the Goo to You via the Zoo. In the movie Contact, Jodie Foster plays a scientist who is part of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence research team. The abbreviation for that team is SETI. SETI, which is a real organization, has scientists who scan space for unmistakable signs of intelligent life. What constitutes an unmistakable sign of intelligent life? A message. That's right, something like "take out the garbage, Mom." In the movie, Foster gets extremely excited when her antenna picks up radio waves that appear to have an intelligent pattern. 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11. Those are primes, she exclaims, meaning those are prime numbers. That can't be natural phenomena. Indeed, random audio waves can be naturally produced, but those that contain a message always have an intelligent source. Prime numbers, from 1 to 101 in order, constitute a message that only comes from an intelligent being. Foster's so confident that extraterrestrial life has been found, she goes public with her discovery. Government and military officials then converge on her facility. If this is such an intelligent source, then why don't they just speak English? One official asks with a hint of derision. Because math is the only universal language, Foster fires back. Of course, Foster's right. In fact, alphabets, and thus language itself, can be ultimately reduced to numbers. This is why the English alphabet is mathematically identical to the genetic alphabet of DNA, and why comparison of cell information to encyclopedias is a one-to-one relationship rather than just an analogy. While Foster and her colleagues later discover a more complicated message embedded in the radio waves, they're absolutely certain that the prime numbers alone prove that the message came from intelligent life. Why are they so certain that the prime numbers came from intelligent life? Because repeated observation tells us that only intelligent beings create messages, and natural laws never create messages. When we see a sequence of prime numbers, we realize that it requires an intelligent cause, just like the messages "take out the garbage, Mom" and "Mary loves Scott" require intelligent causes. Ironically, the movie Contact was based on a novel by the late Carl Sagan, an ardent evolutionist who believed in spontaneous regeneration and who was instrumental in starting the real SETI program. The irony lies in the fact that Sagan was absolutely convinced that a simple string of prime numbers proves the existence of an intelligent being, but the equivalent of 1,000 encyclopedias in the first one-celled life does not require the existence of an intelligent being. How can one require an intelligent being and the other not? It takes a lot of faith for people like Sagan not to believe in God. More faith than people like Frank Turek, Norm Geisler, or me have. Moreover, it was Sagan who wrote this about the human brain. Sagan wrote, quote, "The information content of the human brain expressed in bits is probably comparable to the total number of connections among neurons, about 100 trillion bits. If written out in English, say, that information would fill some 20 million volumes, as many as in the world's largest libraries. The equivalent of 20 million books is inside the heads of every one of us. The brain is a very big place in a very small space. The neurochemistry of the brain is astonishingly busy. The circuitry of a machine more wonderful than any devised by humans," end quote. Actually, Sagan probably underestimated the brain's information content at 20 million books. Nevertheless, the figure is still stunning. To conceptualize it, picture yourself at center court of Madison Square Garden, that's the building up at left, several hours before a Knicks basketball game or a Rangers hockey game. You are the only one in the arena, and you're looking at almost 20,000 seats all around you. How many books would you have to stack on top of each seat in order to fit 20 million books in an empty Madison Square Garden? you would need to stack 1,000 books on each and every seat to fit 20 million books inside Madison Square Garden. Think about that. The roof's not high enough to allow that many books, and you'd have to blow the roof off the building and keep stacking. That's how much specified and complex information is between your ears. So if all that complicated, complex information is between your ears, what are the chances that it evolved by random chance? Sagan was indeed right that the brain's a very big place in a very small space, and it's something immeasurably sophisticated, immeasurably more sophisticated than anything humans have ever created. Now let's review the facts. Sagan realized that the human brain has information that contains the information of 20 million books. Sagan also realized that's drastically more specified and complex than a string of prime numbers. Then why did he think the simpler message required an intelligent being, but not the one, but the message containing 20 million books did not require an intelligent being? Inconsistent. We might also ask Sagan and his fellow Darwinists a question of similar weight. If intelligent human beings can't create anything close to the human brain, why should we expect non-intelligent natural laws to create anything close to the human brain? The Darwinist response will usually involve natural selection. But is this sufficient to account for new life forms? After all, natural selection is a long way from one cell to the human brain. It takes a long way to get from one cell all the way to the human brain. So could natural selection be a sufficient way to explain how we get from one cell to the human brain? Before discussing the origin of new life forms, we need to revisit the problem of the origin of first life. It certainly is a long way from one cell to the human brain, but the journey might be even longer from non-living chemicals to the first cell. That's the most difficult problem for Darwinists, how they get from non-living chemicals to the first cell. But where did the first life come from? Do you see the magnitude of this problem for the Darwinists? If Darwinists don't have an explanation for the first life, then what's the point of speaking about new life forms? The process of macroevolution, if it's possible at all, can't even begin unless there's pre-existing life. So they don't have an explanation for the first life, but yet they're going to try to explain macroevolution when they can't even get the first life, and you need the first life in order to have macroevolution. You need the first life in order to get macroevolution. But as we saw in the last chapter, this doesn't stop the Darwinists. Against all empirical and forensic evidence, Darwinists make up this just-so story, which is spontaneous generation or panspermia, and that magically gives them the first life that they need. This isn't science, this is a joke. In fact, it reminds us of a joke. Steve Martin used to say, "I know how you can be a millionaire and never pay taxes." Steve Martin said, "First get $1 million, okay, now." And that's the joke. The Darwinists' position is even more problematic when you consider that they don't even have an explanation for the source of non-living chemicals, much less an explanation for life. As we saw in the third chapter, one of the most profound questions to ask if there is no God, then why is there something rather than nothing at all? We saw that atheists have no plausible explanation to that question. Why is there something rather than nothing? There's no point for existing. They can't come up with a plausible answer to the question of if there's no God, why is there something rather than nothing? Suggesting a possibility is not enough. They have to present evidence if they're going to be scientific. It's obvious they don't know where the universe came from. A good box top, which is analogous to a worldview, a good worldview should be able to plausibly explain all of the data. If it can't answer the fundamental questions of the origin of the world or the origin of life, it's not a viable box top. If a worldview cannot answer the fundamental questions of the origin of the world or the fundamental questions of the origin of life, it's not a viable worldview. It's time to look for a new worldview. Even though we see that the Darwinist worldview is fundamentally flawed, we need to look at a few of the Darwinist claims that Darwinists make regarding the origin of new life forms. Their theory that Darwinists have regarding the origin of new life forms is macroevolution. You remember macroevolution, from the goo to you via the zoo. It's the belief that all life forms have descended from a common ancestor. the first one-celled creature. And all of this has happened by natural processes without any intelligent intervention. God was not involved in the creation of all life forms, according to macroevolution. According to macroevolution, the creation of all life forms has been a completely blind process. Darwinists say that this has happened by natural selection, but the term natural selection is an incorrect moniker. It is a misnomer, since the process of evolution is, by definition, without intelligence. There is no selection at all going on. It's a blind process. The term natural selection simply means that the fittest creatures survive. So what? That's true by definition. The fittest survive. This is called a tautology, a circular argument that doesn't prove anything. Saying that the fittest survive is a tautology. Saying the fittest survive is a circular argument that doesn't prove anything. This is just a normal function of life. In the animal kingdom, the fittest survive because they are the best suited to fight off their competition in the animal kingdom. Logically, these are the creatures that are best equipped genetically or structurally to deal with changing environmental conditions. That's why they survive. And that's just an additional truth other than the one that I just mentioned as far as the animal kingdom and predators and prey. The fittest creatures are best equipped genetically or structurally to deal with changing environmental conditions. As an example of natural selection, consider what happens to bacteria that are attacked by antibiotics. When bacteria survive a bout with antibiotics and multiply, that surviving group of bacteria may be resistant to that antibiotic. The surviving bacteria are resistant to that antibiotic because the parent bacteria possessed the genetic capacity to resist, or a rare biochemical mutation somehow helped it survive. We say rare because mutations are nearly always harmful. So bacteria become antibiotics are supposed to kill bacteria, but some bacteria resist antibiotics because they develop mutations to keep from being killed by the antibiotics. Since the sensitive bacteria die, those bacteria that have not mutated resistance against the antibiotics, since those bacteria died, the surviving bacteria multiply and now dominate. Darwinists say that the surviving bacteria have evolved. Having adapted to the environment, the surviving bacteria provide us with an example of evolution. Fair enough, but what kind of evolution? The answer we're about to give is absolutely critical. What kind of evolution? This is critical. In fact, outside of the philosophical presuppositions we've been exposing, defining evolution is perhaps the greatest point of confusion in the creation-evolution controversy. This is where Darwinian errors and false claims begin to multiply like bacteria, if not checked by those who believe observation is important to science. So we need to be careful. Here's what observation tells us. Surviving bacteria always stay bacteria. They don't change into something else, which is what macroevolution teaches, that things change into different species or kinds. They do not evolve into another type of organism. Bacteria stay bacteria. They do not evolve into a different type of organism. Evolving into a different type of organism would be macroevolution. Natural selection has never been observed to create new types. But macroevolution is exactly what the Darwinists claim from the data. They say that these observable micro changes can be extrapolated to prove that unobservable macroevolution has occurred. Darwinists make no distinction between microevolution and macroevolution. And they use the evidence for microevolution to prove that macroevolution has occurred. But they can't do this because microevolution and macroevolution are not the same thing. By failing to make this critical distinction, Darwinists can dupe the general public into thinking that any observable change in any organism proves that all life has evolved from the first one-celled creature. This is why it's essential that the right distinctions are made and that all hidden assumptions be exposed when discussing the creation-evolution controversy. So if someone were to ask you, do you believe in evolution, you should ask that person, what do you mean by evolution? Do you mean microevolution or macroevolution? Microevolution's been observed, but it cannot be used, microevolution cannot be used as evidence for macroevolution. Macroevolution has never been observed. Darwinists are masters at defining the term evolution broadly enough so that evidence in one situation might be counted as evidence in another situation. Unfortunately for them, unfortunately for the Darwinists, the public is beginning to catch on to this tactic, thanks largely to the popular works of Berkeley law professor Philip Johnson. Johnson first exposed this Darwinistic sleight of hand with his groundbreaking book, Darwin on Trial. In Johnson's book, Darwin on Trial, Johnson points out that none of the proofs for natural selection provides any persuasive reason for believing that natural selection can produce new species, new organs, or other major changes, or even minor changes that are permanent, end quote. Biologist Jonathan Wells agrees when he writes, quote, biochemical mutations cannot explain the large-scale changes in organisms that we see in the history of life, end quote. Why can't natural selection do the job? Well, here are 5 reasons why natural selection cannot do the job. Why natural selection cannot produce new species or other major changes or even minor changes that are permanent. The first of 5 reasons why natural selection cannot do these things is general genetic limits. Darwinists say that microevolution within types proves that macroevolution has occurred. If these small changes can occur over a short period of time, think what natural selection can do over a long period of time. Unfortunately for Darwinists, genetic limits seem to be built into the basic types. For example, dog breeders always encounter genetic limits when they intelligently attempt to try to create new breeds of dogs. By the way, do you notice that when these Darwinists are trying to create these new dog breeds, do you notice that these Darwinists are applying intelligence into their process to get it to turn out the way that they want to? Do you understand that when they're trying to force their science to come out the way that they have assumed that it will, based on their theory, they are imposing intelligence upon it, and so you can't even test what they want to test without imposing intelligence onto the process. Dogs may range in size from Chihuahua to Great Dane, but despite the best attempts of intelligent dog breeders, dogs always remain dogs. Likewise, despite the best efforts of intelligent scientists to manipulate fruit flies, their experiments have never turned out anything but more fruit flies, and usually crippled ones at that. So fruit flies turn into fruit flies. That is especially significant because the short life of fruit flies allows scientists to test many generations of genetic variation in a short period of time. Most importantly, the comparison between natural selection and the artificial selection that breeders do is completely invalid, as the table in the next slide demonstrates. So we see here from the picture that microevolution occurs within a type. The picture on the left shows different types of dogs, different breeds of dogs. That's an example of microevolution. The picture on the right is supposed to show macroevolution, where all different types of animals come from the same type of organism, and that's not what happens. The biggest difference is the fact that artificial selection is intelligently guided while natural selection is not. Okay, so confusing intelligent with non-intelligent processes is a common mistake of Darwinists. On this table here, we go through some of the crucial differences between artificial selection and natural selection. This was the case when Norm Geisler, confusing intelligent with non-intelligent processes is a common mistake of Darwinists. This common mistake of Darwinists took place when Norman Geisler, one of the co-authors of this book, debated humanist Paul Kurtz in 1986 on the topic of evolution. Okay, if you want to take a moment to look at that table above, at this time, pause the video, and when you're done, you can resume it and continue listening to the slides. The debate moderated by TV apologist John Ankerberg produced this exchange regarding macroevolution. Geisler said, this lady, who's an atheist, said, the atheist said, quote, believing that life came by chance is like believing a Boeing 747 resulted from a tornado going through a junkyard, end quote. You have to have a lot of faith to believe that, Geisler said. Kurtz said, well, the Boeing 747 evolved. Oh, this was brilliant. We can go back to the Wright brothers and see the first kind of airplane that the Wright brothers created. Geisler said, wait a minute. The Wright brothers created an airplane? So if they created an airplane and used intelligence to create that airplane, and then more intelligence was used to create a different kind of airplane based on the previous version of the airplane that existed, is that evolution or is that intelligence? That's what he's getting at. Kurtz says, yes, they created it, but Ankerberg, the host, said, wait, did they create the airplane by intelligence or by chance? And people start laughing. The evolutionist says there was a period of time in which these forms changed, but they didn't create those airplanes using intelligence? I was using the analogy that Dr. Geisler was using, the evolutionist says. Geisler says, well, you're helping my argument. You ought to drop that one and find another one. No, the evolutionist says, I think the point I make is a good one because there have been changes from the simplest to the more complex airplanes. Geisler says, yes, but those changes were by intelligent intervention. Indeed, directional change in airplanes by intelligence proves nothing about the possibility of directional change in living things without intelligence. As we'll see in the next section, directional change in living things by natural selection has not been observed. A directional change in living things with intelligence hits genetic limits. So even when its intelligence is guided, So even when it is intelligently guided, evolution hits walls. In other words, even when scientists intelligently manipulate creatures with an end in mind, which is the antithesis of the blind Darwinian process, macroevolution still does not work. So when scientists, Darwinian scientists, put intelligence into their process to try to fudge the results, to try to prove evolution, their process is not blind, like they claim the Darwinian process is blind. They still can't get the results to come out right because evolution does not work. Macroevolution does not work. If intelligent scientists cannot break genetic barriers, why should we expect non-intelligent natural selection to break genetic barriers? Okay, point number 2, cyclical change. Not only are there genetic limits to change within types, but the change within types appears to be cyclical change. In other words, changes are not directional toward development of new life forms, as macroevolutionary theory requires, but they simply shift back and forth within a limited range. For example, Darwin's finches had varying beak sizes, which are correlated with the weather. Larger beaks helped to crack harder seeds during droughts, and smaller beaks worked fine when wetter weather brought an abundance of smaller, softer seeds. When the weather became drier, the proportion of finches with larger beaks grew relative to the smaller beaked finches. The proportion reversed itself following a sustained period of wet weather. Notice that no new life forms came into existence. They always remained finches. Only the negative proportion of existing large-beaked to small-beaked finches changed, so the finches continued to be finches. They didn't change in kind. They were still finches. Notice also that natural selection cannot explain how finches came into existence in the first place. In other words, natural selection may be able to explain the survival of species, but it cannot explain the arrival of species. Number 3, irreducible complexity. In 1859, Charles Darwin wrote, quote, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down, end quote. We now know that there are many organs, systems, and processes in life that fit this description, and therefore his theory absolutely breaks down. One of those things in life that fit that description is the cell. In Darwin's day, the cell was a black box, a mysterious little part of life that no one could see into. But now that we do have the ability to peer into the cell, we see that life at the molecular level is immeasurably more complex than Darwin ever dreamed. In fact, it's irreducibly complex. An irreducibly complex system is, quote, composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning. Those are the words of Michael Behe, the professor of biochemistry at Lehigh University, who wrote the revolutionary book Darwin's Black Box, The Biochemical Challenge to Evolution. I believe, let's see. Behe's research verified that living things are literally filled with molecular machines that perform the numerous functions of life. These molecular machines are irreducibly complex, meaning that all the parts of each machine must be completely formed in the right places, in the right sizes, in operating order at the same time for the machine to function. The mousetrap is a good example. Maybe we'll get to that later in the presentation. A car engine is an example of such an irreducibly complex system. If a change is made in the size of the pistons, this would require simultaneous changes in the camshaft, the block, the cooling system, the engine compartment, and other systems, or the new engine would not function. Behe shows that living things are irreducibly complex, just like a car engine. With painstaking detail, Behe shows that numerous functions in the body, such as blood clotting, such as cilia, such as vision, require irreducibly complex systems that could not have developed in gradual Darwinian fashion. Why could these systems, these irreducibly complex systems, why could they not have developed in gradual Darwinian fashion? Because intermediates would not be functional. Without all the parts ready to go at the same time, they wouldn't function. As with a car engine, all the right parts must be in place, in the right size, at the same time for there to be any function at all. You can build an engine part by part, and that takes intelligence to build an engine part by part, but you can't drive to work with only a partial engine under the hood. Nor could you drive to work if one essential part of your engine were modified but others were not. In the same way, living systems quickly would become non-functional if they were modified piece by piece. The degree of irreducible complexity in living things is mind-boggling. Recall that DNA's genetic alphabet consists of 4 letters, A, T, C, and G. Well, within each human cell, there are about 3,000 million pairs of those letters. Not only does your body have trillions of cells and make millions of new cells every second, but each cell is irreducibly complex and contains irreducibly complex subsystems. Behe's discoveries are fatal for Darwinism. Irreducible complexity means that new life cannot come into existence by the Darwinian method of slight successive changes over a period of time. Darwinism is akin to natural forces without any intelligent help. Producing a running car engine, which is analogous to an amoeba, and then modifying the irreducibly complex car engine or amoeba into successive intermediate engines until those natural forces finally produce the space shuttle, which is analogous to the human being. You can't do that without intelligence. You can't start from the simple and end at the complex without intelligence. Darwinists can't explain the source of materials to make an engine, much less how any irreducibly complex engine came to be in the first place. Nor can they demonstrate the unintelligent process by which any engine has evolved into a space shuttle while providing propulsion at every intermediate step. This is evident from the complete absence of explanations from Darwinists for how irreducibly complex systems could arise gradually. Behe exposes the empty claims of Darwinists when he writes, "The idea of Darwinism, molecular evolution, is not based on science. There is no publication in the scientific literature, in journals or books, that describes how molecular evolution of any real, complex biochemical system either did occur or even might have occurred. There are assertions that such evolution occurred, but absolutely none are supported by pertinent experiments or calculations. Since there is no authority on which to base claims of knowledge, it can truly be said that the assertion of Darwinism molecular evolution is merely bluster." The feeble attempts by Darwinists to deal with irreducible complexity reveal the magnitude of the problem for their theory. Darwinist Ken Miller has suggested that irreducible complexity isn't true because he can show that Behe's example of Behe's example of irreducible complexity, Behe's example was a mousetrap, isn't really irreducibly complex. According to Behe, this is the mousetrap example. According to Behe, all 5 parts of the traditional mousetrap need to be in place at the same time in working order for the mousetrap to work. You can't catch mice with just a platform and a spring, for example. But Miller thinks he can disprove Behe's point by building a similar mousetrap with only 4 parts. Miller actually brought this up during a televised debate on PBS in the late 1990s. But Miller's critique actually misses the mark. First, like a typical Darwinist, Miller ignores the fact that his mousetrap requires intelligence to build. Second, Behe is not saying you need the 5 parts for any mousetrap, you just need the 5 parts for the traditional mousetrap. It's like a straw man. He's attacking a different mousetrap, not Behe's mousetrap. Turns out Miller's mousetrap is not a physical precursor to Behe's traditional mousetrap. In other words, transforming Miller's mousetrap into Behe's mousetrap would with more than one random Darwinian step, it would require, to transform Miller's mousetrap into Behe's would require more than one random step. It would require the addition of another very specific part and several very specific adjustments to existing parts. And the additional part and the adjustments to existing parts all require intelligence. Third, even if those changes could somehow be made by mindless processes, the mousetrap would be non-functional during the transition period. But for Darwinism to be true, functionality must be maintained at all times, because living things cannot survive if, say, their vital organs do not perform their usable function during slow trial and error Darwinian transitions. Finally, a mousetrap is only an illustration. Living systems are immeasurably more complex than a mousetrap. So, Behe's point clearly has not been refuted by Miller, nor has it been refuted by any other Darwinist. During an Intelligent Design conference in July of 2002, at which Behe and Turek were speakers, one particular Darwinist was a bit militant during the question and answer period of the lectures. Turek wanted to turn the tables and ask the Darwinist a few questions, so Turek made a point to sit next to the Darwinist during lunch. "What do you do with Behe's irreducible complexity argument?" Turek asked the Darwinist. The Darwinist said, "Oh, that's no big deal. There are biochemical scaffolds that are built around the system to evolve gradually." When Turek saw Behe later in that day, Turek told Behe about what the Darwinist said about the biochemical scaffolds. Behe rightly pointed out to Turek that there's no such evidence for the scaffolds, and it complicates matters for the Darwinists the scaffolds do, because if the scaffolds do exist, then who keeps building the scaffolds in just the right places? Building the scaffolds in just the right places requires intelligence. So see, no matter what the evolutionist tries to say to the non-evolutionist, the evolutionist, though they refuse to acknowledge it, they require intelligence to make their rebuttals to the creationists' work. Others have tried to find Darwinian paths around irreducible complexity, but all have failed. Behe confirms as much when he categorically states there's currently no experimental evidence to show that natural selection can get around irreducible complexity, end quote. Behe does not underestimate the implications of irreducible complexity and other discoveries regarding the complexity of life. Behe writes, quote, "The result of these cumulative efforts to investigate the cell, to investigate life at the molecular level, is a loud, clear, piercing cry of design. The result is so unambiguous and so significant that it must be ranked as one of the greatest achievements in the history of science. The discovery rivals those of Newton and Einstein," end quote. Now we're going to discuss the non-viability of transitional forms. Another problem that plagues the possibility of natural selection creating new life forms is the fact that transitional forms could not survive. For example, consider the Darwinian assertion that birds evolved gradually from reptiles over long periods of time. This would necessitate a transition from scales to feathers. How could a creature survive that no longer has scales but does not quite have feathers? Feathers are irreducibly complex. A creature with the structure of half of a feather has no ability to fly. It would be easy prey on land, in water, and from the air. And as a halfway house between reptiles and birds, it probably wouldn't be adept at finding food for itself either. So the problem for Darwinists on this transitional forms issue is twofold. First, they have no viable mechanism for getting from reptiles to birds. And second, if a whole viable mechanism were discovered, the transitional forms would be unlikely to survive anyway. Point number 5, molecular isolation. Darwinists often say that evidence of common descent lies in the fact that all living things contain DNA. For example, Richard Dawkins states, "The reason we know for certain we are all related, including bacteria," Dawkins says, "is the universality of the genetic code and other biochemical fundamentals," end quote. That's Richard Dawkins. Darwinists say that DNA similarity between apes and humans, for example, which some say is over 85 to 95%, strongly implies an ancestral relationship. So if we have 85 to 95% of the same DNA as apes, we must be ancestrally related to them. But is this evident? But here's the question: is this evidence for common ancestry or a common creator? It could be interpreted either way. Perhaps the Darwinists are right. Perhaps it's possible that we have a common genetic code because we've all descended from a common ancestor. But the Darwinists could just as easily be wrong. Perhaps we have a common genetic code because a common creator has designed us to live in the same biosphere. After all, if every living creature were distinct biochemically, a food chain probably could not exist. Perhaps life with a different biochemical makeup is not possible, and even if it is possible, perhaps it couldn't survive in the biosphere. Consider the above picture under the heading of molecular isolation still. So if you have a measuring spoon and bigger measuring cups to smaller pots to bigger pots, does similarity in progression prove that the kettle evolved from the teaspoon? No. Similarity in progression doesn't automatically imply common ancestry. In this case, we know that it means that there's a common creator or a designer. Somebody with intelligence went into creating things that are used for comparable purposes. This is the same situation we have for real living things. As we've said before, the capacity of the DNA genetic alphabet to contain a message is equivalent to the capacity of the English alphabet to contain a message. The only difference is that the DNA alphabet has only 4 letters versus 26 for the English alphabet. Since all living things have DNA with its 4 nitrogen-containing bases, represented by A, T, C, and G, adenine, thymine, cytosine, guanine, we would expect a high degree of similarity in the information among creatures, whether or not they are ancestrally related. Let us use an example from English to illustrate what we mean. Here are 2 sentences with the exact same letters. While the letters in the 2 sentences are identical, and the order is virtually the same, greater than 90%, the slight difference in order yields opposite meanings. Right, so those sentences do not mean the same things. In the same way, only a slight difference in the order of A, C, T, and G in living things may yield creatures that are far apart on the hypothetical evolutionary tree. For example, while some studies show that DNA similarity between humans and most similar ape may be about 90%, other studies show the DNA similarities between humans and mice is also about 90%. Such comparisons are controversial and are not completely understood. So, yeah, why aren't we saying we evolved from mice? Because the DNA similarity between humans and apes is the same as the DNA similarity between humans and mice. So why aren't we talking about humans evolving from mice? More research needs to be done in this field. But if mice genetically are as close to humans as apes are close to humans, this would greatly complicate any Darwinian explanation. But let's suppose that further studies someday show that ape DNA is indeed closer to humans than the DNA of any other creature. This would not prove the Darwinists' conclusion that there is an ancestral relationship. So, if ape DNA is indeed closer to humans than the DNA of any other creature, this would not prove that there is an ancestral relationship between apes and humans as the Darwinists claim. Again, the reason for the similarity could be a common creator rather than a common ancestor, common designer rather than the common ancestor. We must find other evidence at the molecular level to help us discover whether the common genetic code is evidence for a common ancestor or a common creator. The other evidence has been found by comparing protein sequences. Proteins are the building blocks of life. They're composed of long chains of chemical units called amino acids. Most proteins have in their structure more than 100 of these amino acids, which must be in a very specific order. It's the DNA that contains the instructions for ordering the amino acids in the proteins, and the order is critical because any variation usually renders the protein dysfunctional. Here's where the problem arises for the Darwinists. If all species share a common ancestor, if all the species share a common ancestor, we should expect to find protein sequences that are transitional from, say, fish to amphibian or from reptile to mammal. But that's not what we find at all. Instead, we find that the basic types are molecularly isolated from one another, which seems to preclude any type of ancestral relationship. Michael Denton observes, quote, at a molecular level, there's no trace of evolutionary transition from fish to amphibian to reptile to mammal. So, amphibia, always traditionally considered intermediate between fish and other terrestrial vertebrates, are in molecular terms as far from fish as any group of reptiles or mammals. To those well acquainted with the traditional picture of vertebrate evolution, the result is astonishing, end quote. So even though all organisms share a common genetic code with varying degrees of closeness, that code has ordered the amino acids and proteins in such a way that the basic types are in molecular isolation from one another. There are no Darwinian transitions, only distinct molecular gaps. Darwinists cannot explain the presence of these molecular gaps by natural selection any more than they can explain the presence of huge gaps by natural selection any more than they can explain the presence of huge gaps in the fossil record, which we'll talk about next. What about the fossil record? So let's quickly review what we've seen so far. These are the 5 lines of evidence which show that natural selection could not have produced new life forms. Number 1, genetic limits. Number 2, cyclical change. Number 3, irreducible complexity. Number 4, nonviability of transitional forms. Number 5, molecular isolation. But doesn't the fossil record support the Darwinian theory? Well, let's take a look. Without the benefit of today's technology, Charles Darwin could not recognize the problems his theory faced at the cellular level. However, he did recognize that the fossil record posed a big problem for his theory because it didn't show gradualism. That's why Darwin wrote, quote, why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory, end quote. But Darwin thought that further fossil discoveries would reveal that his theory was true. Time has proven Darwin wrong. Contrary to what you may hear in the general media, the fossil record has turned out to be a complete embarrassment for Darwinists. If Darwinism were true, we would have found thousands, if not millions, of transitional fossils by now. Instead, according to the late Harvard paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, who was an evolutionist, quote, the history of most fossil species includes 2 features particularly inconsistent with gradualism. Number 1, stasis. Most species exhibit no directional change during their tenure on Earth. They appear in the fossil record looking much the same as when they disappear. Morphological change is usually limited and directionless, so you don't see things changing. Number 2, the second feature that is inconsistent with gradualism, sudden appearance. In any local area, a species does not arise gradually by the steady formation of its ancestors. It appears all at once and fully formed. In other words, Gould is admitting that fossil types appear suddenly, fully formed, and remain the same until extinction without any directional change. Exactly, and what Gould found, what Gould is admitting, is exactly what one would expect if creation were true. But instead of adopting creation, Gould rejected the gradualism of Darwinism and formulated a theory called punctuated equilibria. Punctuated equilibria suggests that species evolve faster over a shorter period of time, thereby explaining the huge fossil gaps. Gould had no natural mechanism by which this could have occurred, but since he was an atheist, he had to explain the fossil record somehow. This is a classic case of allowing your prejudice to taint your observations, but we digress. The main point here is that the fossil record actually lines up better with supernatural creation than with macroevolution. Indeed, there aren't missing links, there's a missing chain. There's no chain because nearly all of the major groups of animals known to exist appear in the fossil record abruptly and fully formed in strata from the Cambrian period, which many scientists estimate to have occurred between 600 and 500 million years ago. Jonathan Wells writes, "The fossil evidence is so strong and the events so dramatic that it's become known as the Cambrian explosion or biology's Big Bang. The evidence, of course, is completely inconsistent with Darwinism." The Cambrian explosion is inconsistent with Darwinism. All animal groups appear separately, fully formed, and at the same time. That's not evidence of gradual evolution, but it is evidence of instantaneous creation. So the Darwinian tree we're so used to seeing doesn't properly illustrate the real fossil record. In fact, as Wells observes, if any botanical analogy were appropriate, it would be a lawn rather than a tree. And that lawn would have patches of different grasses or plants separated by large areas but of nothing but dirt. At this point you may be thinking, but what about the skull progression we're so used to seeing? Doesn't it appear that man has evolved from apes? A number of years ago, Norm Geisler, one of the co-authors of this book, debated a Darwinist who lined up skulls on a table to illustrate that evolution had occurred. The Darwinist said, "Ladies and gentlemen, right there is the evidence for evolution," he declared. "Gee, how can you ignore the fossils? The skulls look like they're in a progression. They look as if they could be ancestrally related. Is this good evidence for Darwinism?" No, it's not any better than the evidence that the large kettle evolved from the teaspoon. The problem for the Darwinists is that the fossil record cannot establish ancestral relationships. Why can the fossil record not establish ancestral relationships? Because according to Michael Denton, quote, 99% of the biology of any organism resides in its soft anatomy, which is inaccessible in a fossil. In other words, it's extremely difficult to discover the biological makeup of a creature by looking at its fossil remains. Jonathan Wells observes, quote, "The fossil evidence is open to many interpretations because individual specimens can be reconstructed in a variety of ways and because the fossil record cannot establish ancestral descendant relationships." But this does not stop the Darwinists. That was the end of the quote from Denton. Ancestor-descendant relationships, end quote, from Denton. From Wells. Jonathan Wells. But this doesn't stop the Darwinists, since Darwinism has to be true because of their prior philosophical commitment. Darwinists have to find the evidence to support the conclusion so that they can maintain their prior philosophical commitment. So instead of admitting the fossils can establish ancestral relationships, Darwinists take the 1% that fossils tell them and then use the other 99% of leeway to depict their fossil discoveries as filling any gap they want. With such vast leeway and no facts to constrain them, Darwinists have been free to creatively build entire quote-unquote missing links from fossil remains as trivial as a single tooth. Yes, yeah. That's why so many so-called missing links have been later exposed as frauds or mistakes. Henry Guy, chief science writer for Nature, writes, quote, "To take a line of fossils and claim that they represent a lineage is not a scientific hypothesis that can be tested, but an assertion that carries the same validity as a bedtime story, amusing, perhaps even instructive, but not scientific," end quote. Not only is the fossil record inadequate to establish ancestral relationships in light of what we know about the irreducibly complex nature of biological systems, the fossil record is irrelevant to the question. The fossil record cannot be used to establish ancestral relationships. The similarity of structure or anatomy between types, sometimes called homology, also tells us nothing about common ancestry. Michael Behe writes, anatomy is quite simply, or quote from Michael Behe, anatomy is quite simply irrelevant to the question of whether evolution could take place at the molecular level. So is the fossil record. It no longer matters whether there are huge gaps in the fossil record or whether the record is as continuous as that of U.S. presidents. And if there are gaps, it doesn't matter whether they can be explained plausibly. The fossil record has nothing to tell us about whether the interactions of 11 CTS retinal with rhodopsin, transducin, and phosphodiesterase, which are irreducibly complex systems, could have developed step by step, end quote. So according to Behe, biology dwarfs anatomy on the question of the plausibility of macroevolution. Just as the contents of a book provide far more information than its cover, the biology of a creature provides far more information than its skeletal nature. Nevertheless, Darwinists have argued that similarity of structure between, say, apes and humans is evidence of common ancestry or common descent. But does it ever dawn on the Darwinists that similarity of structure may be evidence of a common designer rather than evidence for a common ancestor? After all, in a world governed by certain physical and chemical laws, perhaps only a certain range of anatomical structures will be conducive to animals designed to walk on two legs. Since we all have to live in the same biosphere, we should expect some creatures to have similar designs. Moreover, while apes have a similar structure to humans, what's often overlooked is the fact that apes and humans bear almost no resemblance to snakes, fungus, and trees. But according to Darwinists, all living things have evolved from the same ancestor. To posit Darwinism, you must be able to explain the vast dissimilarity between living things. You must explain how the palm tree, peacock, octopus, locust, bat, hippopotamus, porcupine, seahorse, Venus flytrap, human, and mildew, for example, have all descended from the first irreducibly complex life without intelligent intervention. You also have to explain how the first life in the universe came into existence as well. Without viable explanations, which Darwinists have failed to provide, it takes too much faith to be a Darwinist, and that's why we don't have enough faith to be Darwinists. Much more could be said about macroevolution, but space does not permit us to go any further. Nevertheless, a reasonable conclusion can be drawn from the data we have investigated in this chapter. In light of the fossil record, molecular isolation, transitional difficulties, irreducible complexity, cyclical change, and genetic limits, and the fact that they can't explain the origin of the universe or the first life, you would think Darwinists might finally admit that their theory doesn't fit the observable evidence. Instead, Darwinists are still providing unsubstantiated just-so stories that actually contradict scientific observation. They continue to insist that evolution is a fact. We agree that evolution is a fact, but not in the sense that Darwinists mean it. If you define evolution as change, then certainly living beings have evolved. But this evolution is on the micro level, not the macro level. As we've seen, there's not only a lack of evidence for macroevolution, there's positive evidence that macroevolution has not occurred. If macroevolution is not true, then what is? Well, if there's no explanation for the origin of new life forms, then if there's no natural explanation for the origin of new life forms, then there must be an intelligent explanation. It's the only other option. If there's no natural explanation, then it must be an intelligent explanation. There's no halfway house between intelligence and non-intelligence. Either intelligence was involved or intelligence was not involved. But Darwinists don't like the option that intelligence was involved. So once they exhaust their ability to adequately defend their own position with unbiased scientific evidence, which is very quickly, because their quote-unquote evidence is biased, Darwinists typically turn their guns on the intelligent design people, who are those of us who believe that there's intelligence behind the universe and life. Here are the Darwinist typical objections, and here are the intelligent design responses. So here's an objection that Darwinists raise to the intelligent design alternative. The first objection is that intelligent design is not science. The answer to the objection that intelligent design is not science is that, as we have seen, science is a search for causes, and there are only two types of causes: intelligent causes and non-intelligent causes, or natural causes. The Darwinists claim that intelligent design is not science is based on their definition of science. Is based on their biased definition of science. Right. The Darwinists claim that intelligent design is not science because their bias informs their view. But that is arguing in a circle. Circular reasoning. If your definition of science rules out intelligent causes beforehand, then you'll never consider intelligent design as science. The irony for Darwinists is this: if intelligent design is not science, then neither is Darwinism. Why? Because both Darwinists and intelligent design scientists are trying to discover what happened in the past. Origin questions are forensic questions. And because they're forensic questions, they require the use of forensic science principles we've already discussed. In fact, for Darwinists to rule out intelligent design from the realm of science, in addition to ruling out themselves, they would have to rule out archaeology, cryptology, criminal and accident forensic investigations, and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. These are all legitimate forensic sciences that look into the past for intelligent causes. Something must be wrong with the Darwinist definition of science. Okay, the bullet table shows the difference between empirical science and forensic science. Empirical science on the left, forensic science on the right. Empirical science studies the present. Forensic science studies the past. Empirical science studies regularities. Forensic science studies singularities. Empirical science is operational science. Forensic science is origin science. Empirical science studies repeatable things. Forensic science studies unrepeatable things. In empirical science, recreation is possible. In forensic science, recreation is impossible. So yeah, you can't go back. So forensic science, a cold case detective. There's one particular Christian that's pretty popular right now among Christian apologists. He's written a couple books, and he talks about his experience as a cold case detective and how that approach helped him in investigating evidence for those murders. He used the same approach to study the evidence for the Christian faith and turned from atheist to Christian. So empirical science studies how things work. Forensic science studies how things began. Empirical science is tested by repeatable experience. Forensic science is tested by uniformity. Examples of empirical operation science are: how does water fall? And an example of forensic science is: what is the origin of the hydroelectric plant? An example of empirical science is: how does rock erode? And an example of forensic science is: what is the origin of Mount Rushmore? An example of empirical science is: how does an engine work? And an example of forensic science is: what's the origin of an engine? An example of empirical science is: how does ink adhere to paper? An example of forensic science is: what is the origin of a book? Empirical science example is: how does life function? Forensic science example is: what is the origin of life? An empirical science example is: how does the universe operate? A forensic science example is: what is the origin of the universe? Okay, the next objection to intelligent design is that intelligent design commits the God of the gaps fallacy. The God of the gaps fallacy, in response to that objection, occurs when someone falsely believes that God caused the event when it was really caused by undiscovered natural phenomena. For example, people used to believe that lightning was caused directly by God. There was a gap in our knowledge of nature, so we attributed the effect to God. Darwinists assert that theists are doing the same thing by claiming that God created the universe and life. Are Darwinists correct when they say that? They're not correct for a number of reasons. First, when we conclude that intelligence created the first cell or the human brain, it's not simply because we lack evidence of a natural explanation. It's also because we have positive, empirically detectable evidence for an intelligent cause. A message which has specified complexity is empirically detectable. When we detect a message like "take out the garbage, mom," or a thousand encyclopedias, we know that a message must come from an intelligent being because all our observational experience tells us that messages come only from intelligent beings. Every time we observe a message, it comes from an intelligent being. We couple this data with the fact that we never observe natural laws creating messages, and we know that an intelligent being must be the cause. That's a valid scientific conclusion based on observation and repetition. It's not an argument from ignorance, nor is it based on any gap in our knowledge. Second, intelligent design scientists are open to both natural and intelligent causes. They're not opposed to continued research into a natural explanation for the first life. They're simply observing that all known natural explanations fail, and all empirically detectable evidence points to an intelligent designer. The next objection: intelligent design. Yeah, no, we're still on the God of the Gaps fallacy. Now one can question the wisdom of continuing to look for a natural cause of life. William Dembski, who's published extensive research on intelligent design, asks, when does determination to find a natural cause become pig-headedness? How long are we to continue a search before we have the right to give up the search and declare not only that continuing the search is vain, but also that the very object of the search is non-existent? Consider the implications of Dembski's question. Should we keep looking for a natural cause for phenomena like Mount Rushmore or messages like take out the garbage mom? When is the case closed? Walter Bradley, a co-author of the seminal work The Mystery of Life's Origin, believes, quote, there doesn't seem to be the potential of finding a natural explanation, end quote, for the origin of life. Bradley added, quote, I think people who believe that life emerged naturalistically need to have a great deal more faith than people who reasonably infer that there is an intelligent designer, end quote. It takes more faith to be a naturalist than it does, it takes more faith to be a naturalist than it does to be a creationist. Regardless of whether or not you think we should keep looking for a natural explanation, the main point is that intelligent design scientists are open to both natural and intelligent causes. It just so happens that an intelligent cause best fits the evidence. Third, the intelligent design conclusion is falsifiable. In other words, intelligent design could be disproven if natural laws were someday discovered to create specified complexity. However, the same cannot be said about the Darwinist position. Darwinists don't allow falsification of their creation story because, as we've described, they don't allow any other creation story to be considered. Darwinist science is not tentative or open to correction. It's more closed-minded than the most dogmatic church doctrine that Darwinists are so apt to criticize. Finally, it's actually the Darwinists who are committing the God of the Gaps fallacy. Darwin himself was once accused of considering natural selection an active power of deity in Chapter 4 of his Origin of Species. But it seems that natural selection is actually the deity or God of the Gaps for the Darwinists today. When they are totally at a loss for how irreducibly complex, information-rich biological systems come into existence, Darwinists simply cover their gap in knowledge by claiming that natural selection, time, and chance did it. The ability of such a mechanism to create information-rich biological systems runs counter to the observational evidence. Mutations are always nearly harmful, and time and chance do the Darwinists no good, as we explained in Chapter 5. At best, natural selection may be responsible for minor changes in living species, but it cannot explain the origin of basic forms of life. You need a living thing to start with you need a living thing to start with for any natural selection to take place. Yet, despite the obvious problems with their mechanism, Darwinists insist that it covers the gap in their knowledge. Moreover, they willfully ignore the positive, empirically detectable evidence for an intelligent being. This is not science, but the dogma of secular religion. Darwinists, like the opponents of Galileo, are letting their religion overrule scientific observations. Okay, next objection. Intelligent design is religiously motivated. This objection has two aspects. The first is that some intelligent design people may be religiously motivated. So what? Because some intelligently designed people may be religiously motivated, does that make intelligent design false? Does the religious motivation of some Darwinists make Darwinism false? No. The truth doesn't lie in the truth does not lie in the motivation of the scientists, but in the quality of the evidence. Just because somebody has a philosophical or religious motivation doesn't mean that their conclusion is false. To determine whether or not their conclusion is false, you have to look at the evidence. A scientist's motivation or bias doesn't necessarily mean that the scientist is wrong. The scientist could have a bias and still be right. The bias or motivation is not the main issue. The truth is the main issue. Sometimes the objection is stated this way: you can't believe anything he or she says about origins because he or she is a creationist. Well, if the sword cuts it all, it cuts both ways. We could just as easily say, you can't believe anything he or she says about origins because he or she is a Darwinist. Why are creationist conclusions immediately thought to be biased, but Darwinist conclusions are automatically considered to be objective? Because most people don't realize that atheists have a worldview just like creationists do. As we're seeing, the atheist worldview is not neutral and actually requires more faith than the creationist worldview. Now, as we said earlier, if philosophical or religious biases prevent someone from interpreting the evidence correctly, we could have grounds for questioning that person's conclusions. In the current debate, the problem seems to afflict Darwinists more than anyone else. Yet the main point is that even if someone is motivated by religion or philosophy, their conclusions can be corrected by an honest look at the evidence. Scientists on both sides of the fence may have a difficult time being neutral, but if they have integrity, they can be objective. The second aspect of this objection is the charge that intelligent design people don't have any evidence for their view, that they're simply parroting what the Bible says. The aspect of this objection does not work either. Intelligent design beliefs may be consistent with the Bible, but they're not based on the Bible. As we've seen, intelligent design is a conclusion based on empirically detected evidence, not sacred texts. As Michael Behe observes, life on Earth at its most fundamental level, in its most critical components, is the product of intelligent activity. The conclusion of intelligent design flows naturally from the data itself, not from sacred books or sectarian beliefs." End quote. Intelligent design is not creation science either. Intelligent design scientists don't make claims that so-called creation scientists make. Intelligent design scientists don't say that the data unambiguously supports the 624-hour day view of Genesis or a worldwide flood. Instead, intelligent design scientists acknowledge that the data for intelligent design is not based on a specific age or geologic history of the Earth. Intelligent design scientists study the same objects in nature that the Darwinists study. They study life in the universe itself, but they come to a more reasonable conclusion about the cause of those objects. In short, regardless of what the Bible may say in a topic, Darwinism is rejected because it doesn't fit the scientific data, and intelligent design is accepted because it does fit the scientific data. Darwinism is rejected because it doesn't fit the scientific data. Intelligent design is accepted because it does fit the scientific data. Next objection: intelligent design is false because the so-called design is not perfect. The answer: Darwinists have long argued that if a designer existed, he would have designed his creatures better. Stephen Jay Gould pointed this out in his book, The Panda's Thumb, where he suggested the apparent suboptimal design of a bony extrusion pandas have for a thumb. The problem for the Darwinists is that this actually turns out to be an argument for a designer rather than an argument against a designer. First, the fact that Gould could identify something as suboptimal design implies that he knows what optimal design is. You can't know something is imperfect unless you know what perfect is. So Gould's observation of even suboptimal design implies that design is detectable in the panda's thumb. By the way, this is another reason the Darwinists are wrong when they assert that intelligent design is not science. When they claim something isn't designed correctly, they're implying they could tell if it were designed correctly. That proves what intelligent design scientists have been saying all along. Intelligent design is science because design is empirically detectable. Suboptimal design doesn't mean there's no design. In other words, even if you grant that something is not designed optimally, that doesn't mean it's not designed at all. Your car isn't designed optimally, yet it's still designed. It certainly wasn't put together by natural laws. In order to say something is suboptimal, you must know what the objectives or purpose of the designer are. If Gould doesn't know what the designer intended, then he can't say the design falls short of those intentions. How could Gould know the panda's thumb isn't exactly what the designer had in mind? Gould assumes the pandas should have opposable thumbs like those of humans, but maybe the designer wanted the panda's thumbs to be just as they are. After all, the panda's thumb works just fine in allowing him to strip bamboo down to its edible interior. Maybe the pandas don't need opposable thumbs because they don't need to write books like Gould. They simply need to strip bamboo. Gould can't fault the designer of that thumb because it wasn't intended to do more than strip bamboo. Finally, in a world constrained by physical reality, all design requires trade-offs. Laptop computers, like the one this presentation is being filmed on, must strike a balance between size, weight, and performance. Larger cars must be more safe and comfortable, but they also are more difficult to maneuver and consume more fuel. High ceilings make rooms more dramatic, but they also consume more energy. Because trade-offs cannot be avoided in this world, engineers must look for a compromise position that best achieves the intended objectives. For example, you can't fault the design in a compact car because it doesn't carry 15 passengers. The car maker traded size for fuel economy and achieved the intended objective. Likewise, it could be said that the design of the panda's thumb is a trade-off that still achieves its objectives. The panda's thumb is just right for stripping bamboo. If the thumb had been designed in any other way, it would have hindered the pandas in some other way. We simply don't know without knowing the objectives of the designer. What we do know is that Gould's criticism cannot succeed without knowing those objectives. So if the evidence is so strong for intelligent design, then why are there still Darwinists? After all, these people are not dummies. Their names are usually followed by the letters PhD. The first thing to take note is that this is not just an intellectual issue where Darwinists take a dispassionate look at the evidence and then make a rational conclusion. Richard Dawkins has famously written, "It's absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims to not believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that." End quote. Boy. Of course, Dawkins' statement is simply false. There are brilliant PhDs who believe in intelligent design. But the real question is, why the invectives? Why the emotion? Why the hostility? I thought this was science. There must be something else at stake here. There is. Let's go back to Richard Lewontin's quote from the last chapter. Recall his assertion that Darwinists believe in the absurdities that they do because materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door, end quote. Now that's the real issue, keeping God out. But why would Darwinists not want a divine foot in the door? We suggest four main reasons. Reason number one. First, by admitting God, Darwinists would be admitting that they are not the highest authority when it comes to truth. Currently, in this technologically advanced world, scientists are viewed by the public as the revered authority figures, the new priests who make a better life possible and who comprise the sole source of objective truth. Allowing the possibility of God would be to relinquish their claim of superior authority. Second, by admitting God, Darwinists would be admitting that they don't have absolute authority when it comes to explaining causes. In other words, if God exists, they couldn't explain every event as a result of predictable natural laws. Richard Lewontin put it this way, quote, "To appeal to an omnipotent deity is to allow that at any moment the regularities of nature may be ruptured, that miracles may happen," end quote. As Jastrow noted, when that happens, the scientist has lost control, certainly to God and perhaps to the theologian. Third, by admitting God, Darwinists would risk losing financial security and professional admiration. How would they risk losing financial security and professional admiration? Because there's tremendous pressure in the academic community to publish something that supports evolution. Find something important, and you may find yourself on the cover of National Geographic or the subject of a PBS special. Find nothing, and you may find yourself out of a job, out of grant money, or at least out of favor with your materialist colleagues. So there's a money, job security, and prestige motive to advance the Darwinian worldview. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, by admitting God, Darwinists would be admitting that they don't have the authority to define right and wrong for themselves. By ruling out the supernatural, Darwinists can avoid the possibility that anything is morally prohibited. For if there is no God, everything is lawful, and a character in a Dostoevsky novel as a character in a Dostoevsky novel observed. If there is no God, everything is lawful. We'll elaborate on the connection between God and morality in the next chapter. In fact, the late Julian Huxley, once a leader among Darwinists, admitted that sexual freedom is a popular motivation behind evolutionary dogma. When Huxley was asked by talk show host Merv Griffin, why do people believe in evolution? Huxley honestly answered Griffin and said, quote, "The reason we accepted Darwinism even without proof," should stop right there. The reason we accepted Darwinism even without proof, they accepted Darwinism without proof, is because we didn't want God to interfere with our sexual mores, end quote. They wanted to sleep with who they wanted to sleep with. They wanted to live how they wanted to live. They didn't want to have any objective final authority for why they do what they do. They wanted to do what felt right to them. They wanted to do what was right in their own eyes. They wanted to, if it feels good, do it. And that is the underlying motivation behind the materialistic worldview today. Notice he didn't cite evidence for spontaneous generation or evidence from the fossil record. The motivation that Huxley observed is to be prevalent among the motivation Huxley observed to be prevalent among evolutionists was based on moral preferences, not scientific evidence. Let me say this as a disclaimer. It is not true that every atheist is an immoral heathen. It is not true that every atheist is that. There are atheists who live moral, respectable, profitable lives. There are atheists who can be compassionate, who can be loving, who can be servants, and who can do a lot of good in this world. And there are who do. I can think of one in particular right now as I film this. So don't hear me say that it's impossible for atheists to be good moral people. That's not what I'm saying, and that's not what Turek and Geisler say. In fact, if you've ever heard Turek speak, Geisler's been dead for a while, but if you've ever heard Turek speak, he would say something similar to me, that atheists can do good things, can do positively moral things. Okay, so that disclaimer out of the way, clearly stating here that atheists can do good and be kind and those kinds of things. So the motivation that Huxley observed to be prevalent among evolutionists was based on moral preferences, not scientific evidence. Former atheist Lee Strobel, author of books like Case for a Creator, Case for Faith, Case for Christ, reveals that he had the same motivation when he believed in Darwinism. Strobel writes, I was more happy to latch onto Darwinism as an excuse to jettison the idea of God so I could unabashedly pursue my own agenda in life without moral constraints, end quote. Author and lecturer Ron Carlson has had the Darwinists admit the same to him. On one such occasion, after lecturing at a major university on the problems of Darwinism and the evidence for intelligent design, Carlson had dinner with a biology professor who attended his presentation. Carlson asked the biology professor, "What'd you think of my lecture?" "Well, Ron," the professor responded to Carlson, what you say is true. It makes a lot of sense, but I'm going to continue to teach Darwinism anyway." Carlson was baffled. Carlson said to the biology professor, "Why would you do that?" The biology professor said to Carlson, "Well, to be honest with you, it's because Darwinism is morally comfortable." "Morally comfortable? What do you mean?" Carlson pressed. "I mean, if Darwinism is true," the professor said, "if there's no God and we all evolved from slimy green algae, then I can sleep with whomever I want," observed the professor. Well, now that is painfully honest. The professor said, quote, "In Darwinism, there's no moral accountability," end quote. And I agree with Turek and Geisler here. That is a moment of complete candor. Of course, that's not to say that all Darwinists think this way or that all Darwinists are immoral. Some undoubtedly live morally better lives than many so-called Christians. That's what I said about a minute or two ago. It simply reveals that some Darwinists are motivated not by the evidence, but rather by a desire to remain free from the perceived moral restraints of God. Yes, they will just plug their ears and la 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 la, no evidence, even though they see the evidence, they hear the evidence, they reject the evidence because they don't want the moral accountability. That's the issue. It's not that there's no evidence. They don't want the moral accountability. That's the issue. I've seen it with my own two eyes. That's the issue. This motivation may drive them. Anybody who knows me knows why I would say that. This motivation may drive them to suppress the evidence for a creator so they can continue to live the way they want to live, or let other people live the way they want to live. That's why people reject Christianity and continue to deny the obvious and say there's no evidence when there is evidence. We've been going through the evidence on this channel. In this sense, Darwinism is no different than many other world religions, and that it provides a way to deal with the guilt that results from immoral behavior. The difference is that some Darwinists, instead of acknowledging guilt and offering ways to atone for it or rules to avoid it, attempt to avoid any implication of guilt by asserting that there's no such thing as an immoral behavior to be guilty about. That's right, because if there's no lawgiver, then there's no law, and so anything goes. Like it says at the end of the book of Judges, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Well, that's what you can do under Darwinism. You can do whatever you feel like doing. These four motivations that we've suggested should not surprise us. Sex and power are the motivations that underlie many of our most intense cultural debates, such as those about abortion and homosexuality. Too often, people take positions in those debates that merely line up with their personal desires rather than taking the evidence into account. In the same way, belief in Darwinism is often a matter of the will rather than the mind. Sometimes people refuse to accept what they know to be true because of the impact it will have on their personal lives. This explains why some Darwinists suggest such absurd counterintuitive explanations that are against common sense. Despite the plain evidence for design, these Darwinists fear encroachment of God into their personal lives more than they fear being wrong about their scientific conclusions. That's not to say that all Darwinists have such motivations for their theory. We think, Darwinists get this misconception because most Darwinists rarely study the research of those in other fields. As a result, very few get the big picture. This is especially true of biologists. Molecular and cell biologist Jonathan Wells observes most biologists are honest, hard-working scientists who insist on accurate presentation of the evidence, but who rarely venture outside their own fields. In other words, although they do honest work, they only see their own piece of the puzzle. Since they've been taught that the Darwinian box top of the puzzle is generally true, it's just those pesky details that remain unresolved. Most biologists interpret their piece of the puzzle with that box top in mind, giving the benefit of the doubt to the Darwinian view and assuming that the really strong evidence for Darwinism lies in another field of biology. So even if they can't see the evidence for spontaneous generation or macroevolution in their piece of the puzzle, the evidence must be somewhere else in biology because the Darwinian box top requires those things to be true. These circumstances leave the evolutionary paradigm unchallenged by the majority of biologists. So we couldn't leave the discussion of evolution and creation without at least mentioning the age of the universe. Since there are several views on this topic, especially within Christian circles, we do not have space to treat them all here. However, we do want to point out that while the age of the universe is certainly an interesting theological question, the more important question is not when the universe was created, but that it was created. As we've seen, the universe exploded into being out of nothing and has been precisely tweaked to support life on Earth. Since this universe, including the entire space-time continuum, had a beginning, it required a beginner, no matter how long ago that beginning was. Likewise, since the universe is designed, it required a designer, no matter how long ago it was designed. We can debate how long the days in Genesis were, or whether the assumptions that are made in the dating techniques are valid, but when we have those debates, we must be sure not to obscure the larger point that this creation requires a creator. Now to the summary and conclusion. Let's get to the bottom line. There are only two possibilities. Either God created us or we created God. Either God really exists or he's just a creation of our minds. As we've seen, Darwinism, not God, is a creation of the human mind. You've got to have a lot of faith to be a Darwinist. To be a Darwinist, without intelligent intervention, something arose from nothing. The origin of the universe happened. Without intelligent intervention, order arose from chaos. The universe has got the design that it somehow has. Without intelligent intervention, if you're a Darwinist, life arose from non-life, which means that intelligence arose from non-intelligence and personality arose from non-personality. Without intelligent intervention, if you're a Darwinist, new life forms arose from existing life forms despite the evidence to the contrary, such as genetic limits, cyclical change, irreducible complexity, molecular isolation, non-viability of transitional forms, and the fossil record. So the evidence is not good for macroevolution. But what about theistic macroevolution? Perhaps what can't be explained naturally makes good sense if you add God to the picture. Why suggest that? If there were evidence for God and for macroevolution, then there might be a reason to combine the two. But as we've seen, there's no good evidence that macroevolution has occurred. It's not like you have contradictory evidence, some evidence that points to macroevolution and other evidence that disproves macroevolution. If you had, say, a fossil record with millions of transitional forms on the one hand, but irreducibly complex on another, irreducibly complex creatures on another, then perhaps you could suggest that God guided evolution through these unbridgeable gaps. But since that's not the case, it seems that God wasn't needed to guide macroevolution because there's no evidence macroevolution occurred. Finally, let's look at the evidence with another question in mind. What would the evidence have to look like for creation or intelligent design to be true? How about a universe that has exploded into being out of nothing? A universe with over 100 fine-tuned, life-enabling constants for this tiny, remote planet called Earth. Life that has been observed to rise only from existing life. It's never been observed to rise spontaneously. Life that consists of thousands and even millions of volumes of empirically detectable specified complexity, and therefore more than just non-living chemicals it contains. So there's all this specified complexity. Life that changes cyclically and only within a limited range. Life that cannot be built or modified gradually. Life that is irreducibly complex. Life that is molecularly isolated between basic types. There's no ancestral progression at the molecular level. Life that leaves a fossil record of fully formed creatures that appear suddenly, do not change, and then disappear suddenly. An honest look at the facts suggests that creation, not macroevolution, is true. As we've seen, atheists have to work really hard not to conclude the obvious. That's why they need to have a lot more faith than we do. Finally, we have a proposal to help resolve the debate in America over what should be taught in public schools regarding creation and evolution. What would be wrong with teaching them what we've just discovered in chapters 3 through 6? Notice we haven't been quoting Bible verses to make our points. We've been citing scientific evidence. So this isn't a battle of science versus religion. It's a battle of good science versus bad science. Right now, most of our children are being taught bad science because they're being taught evolution only. It doesn't have to be that way. What would be unconstitutional about teaching the surge evidence, showing them the complexity of the simplest life, making the distinctions between micro and macroevolution, and between forensic and empirical science, or exposing the problems with macroevolution? There'd be nothing wrong with that. So why do we continue to indoctrinate our children in a flawed and crumbling theory that is based more on philosophical presuppositions than on scientific observations? Why don't we give our children all the scientific evidence, pro and con, and let them make up their own minds? After all, shouldn't we be teaching them how to think critically on their own? Of course we should, but Darwinists will go to great lengths to ensure that doesn't happen. Darwinists would rather suppress the evidence than allow it to be treated fairly. Why? Because this is the one area where Darwinists lack faith. They lack the faith to believe that their theory will still be believed after our children see all the evidence. That concludes this chapter of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek. Thank you for exercising patience and making it all the way to the end of this video. Next time, we'll discuss the moral argument for God's existence, and that is discussed in the next chapter, which is entitled Mother Teresa versus Hitler. So thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Please consider supporting my ministry by purchasing my published work. Please pray for this ministry, and I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.